Kind black teen helps old white woman. She calls cops on him. You won't believe what happens next. In the heart of a bustling suburban neighborhood, where manicured lawns met picket fences, lived Jamal Thompson, a 17-year-old high school senior with dreams as vast as the summer sky. Jamal was known throughout Oak Ridge High for his infectious smile and his uncanny ability to brighten even the gloomiest of days. His parents, both hardworking professionals, had instilled in him a deep sense of community and the importance of lending a helping hand to those in need. Jamal's father, Marcus, was a respected electrician who had taught his son the ins and outs of household repairs from a young age. Knowledge is power, son, Marcus would often say, but kindness is what truly lights up the world. These words had become Jamal's mantra, guiding his actions and shaping his character. Living just a few houses down from the Thompsons was Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, a 78-year-old widow who had called Maple Street home for over 5 decades. Once a pillar of the community, organizing bake sales and neighborhood watches, Mrs. Whitaker had become increasingly reclusive in recent years. The loss of her husband, coupled with the rapid changes in the neighborhood's demographics, had left her feeling out of place and wary of her new neighbors. As the only black family on the block, the Thompsons had faced their fair share of sideways glances and whispered comments. But Marcus and his wife, Cheryl, chose to combat prejudice with patience and perseverance, hoping that their actions would speak louder than any preconceived notions. Jamal, with his youthful optimism, saw each neighbor as a potential friend, regardless of age or background. He mowed lawns for the elderly, helped carry groceries for busy moms, and even organized a neighborhood cleanup day as part of his school's community service project. Little did Jamal know that his next act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would challenge his beliefs, test his resilience, and ultimately spark a conversation that would ripple through the community, forcing everyone to confront their hidden biases and the power of human connection. As the sun dipped below the horizon on a warm Friday evening, casting long shadows across Maple Street, Jamal was about to embark on an encounter that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone in the quiet suburb he called home. The day had been particularly sweltering, the kind of heat that seemed to melt the asphalt and turn car interiors into makeshift saunas. Jamal had just returned from his part-time job at the local community center, where he spent his afternoons tutoring younger kids and helping with various youth programs. As he walked up the driveway, wiping beads of sweat from his brow, he noticed Mrs. Whitaker struggling with a large box on her front porch. Without hesitation, Jamal jogged over, his fatigue forgotten. "Need a hand, Mrs. Whitaker?" he called out, his voice warm and friendly. The elderly woman startled, nearly dropping the box. She eyed Jamal warily, her thin lips pressed into a tight line. "I'm fine," she muttered, attempting to maneuver the awkward package. Jamal, undeterred by her curt response, approached slowly, with his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "That looks pretty heavy. I'd be happy to carry it inside for you. No trouble at all." Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, her pale blue eyes darting between Jamal and the box. After a moment of internal debate, she relented with a sigh. "Very well, but be careful, it's fragile." As Jamal carefully lifted the box, he noticed the label, Tiffany-style table lamp. He smiled, remembering how his father had once restored a similar lamp for a client. "This is a beautiful piece, Mrs. Whitaker. My dad works with lamps like these sometimes." The old woman's eyebrows raised slightly, a flicker of interest crossing her face before it was quickly suppressed. She led Jamal into her living room, a space that seemed frozen in time, with doilies on every surface and photos of a bygone era adorning the walls. As Jamal set the box down, he couldn't help but notice the dim lighting in the room. The overhead fixture flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows. "Is everything all right with your lights, Mrs. Whitaker?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "It's been acting up for days," she admitted reluctantly. "I've been meaning to call an electrician, but they charge an arm and a leg these days." Jamal's face lit up. "You know, I could take a look if you'd like. My dad's taught me a thing or two about electrical work." Mrs. Whitaker's initial instinct was to refuse, to usher this young man out of her home as quickly as possible. But something in Jamal's earnest expression gave her pause. Perhaps it was the genuine kindness in his eyes, or maybe it was the mounting frustration with her flickering lights. Whatever the reason, she found herself nodding hesitantly. "I suppose it couldn't hurt to have a look," she conceded. Jamal's smile widened as he set to work, first examining the light switch and then the fixture itself. As he worked, he chatted amiably, sharing stories about his family and his aspirations to study engineering in college. Mrs. Whitaker, despite her initial reservations, found herself relaxing slightly. She even shared a few anecdotes about her late husband's DIY projects around the house, which often ended in disaster and a call to a professional. After about 20 minutes of tinkering, Jamal stepped back with a satisfied grin. "Try it now, Mrs. Whitaker." With a skeptical look, the old woman flipped the switch. To her amazement, the room was instantly bathed in steady, bright light. A small gasp escaped her lips. "It was just a loose connection," Jamal explained. "Easy fix, but it could have been dangerous if left unchecked." For a brief moment, gratitude softened Mrs. Whitaker's features. "Well, thank you," she said, her voice carrying a hint of warmth for the first time. As Jamal prepared to leave, he noticed Mrs. Whitaker struggling with the new lamp. "Would you like help setting that up too?" he offered. Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, then nodded. "If you don't mind," she said softly. Together, they unpacked the lamp, with Jamal carefully assembling it, while Mrs. Whitaker directed where it should be placed. As the Tiffany-style lamp cast its colorful glow across the room, something shifted in the atmosphere. A tentative bridge had been built, spanning generations and preconceptions. As Jamal bid Mrs. Whitaker good night, neither of them could have predicted the storm that was brewing. Ready to test the fragile connection they had just formed. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil that was about to unfold. Jamal, still riding the high of his good deed, went about his usual Saturday routine. He mowed the lawn, helped his mother with groceries, and was just settling down to work on a school project when a commotion outside caught his attention. Peering out the window, Jamal's heart nearly stopped. 2 police cruisers were parked in front of Mrs. Whitaker's house, their lights flashing silently in the mid-morning sun. Officers were speaking with the elderly woman on her porch, and to Jamal's shock and confusion, she seemed to be pointing directly at his house. Before Jamal could process what was happening, a sharp knock on the front door sent a jolt through the Thompson household. Marcus answered, his face a mask of calm concern as he faced the 2 officers on his doorstep. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "We're here to speak with Jamal Thompson," one of the officers stated, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Is he home?" Jamal stepped forward, his mind racing. "I'm Jamal," he said, fighting to keep his voice from trembling. "What's this about?" The officers exchanged a glance before the senior one spoke. "We received a call from your neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker. She claims that you entered her home under false pretenses yesterday evening and may have stolen several valuable items." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jamal felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His parents, standing protectively on either side of him, were momentarily stunned into silence. "There must be some mistake," Cheryl finally managed, her voice tight with disbelief. Jamal was helping Mrs. Whitaker fix her light. He would never. The officer held up a hand, cutting her off. "Ma'am, we're just here to investigate the complaint. We'd like to ask Jamal a few questions, if that's all right." What followed was a surreal interrogation in the Thompsons' living room. Jamal recounted the events of the previous evening in painstaking detail, his voice growing stronger as he described his interaction with Mrs. Whitaker and the work he had done. As Jamal spoke, a dawning realization spread across the room. The officer's initial skepticism began to waver, replaced by a growing understanding of the situation's complexity. "Did Mrs. Whitaker mention any specific items that were allegedly stolen?" Marcus asked, his lawyer instincts kicking in. The officer shared another look. "Actually, she was quite vague about that," the younger one admitted. "She just insisted that things were out of place and that she felt uncomfortable." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of this revelation sank in. It wasn't about theft at all. Mrs. Whitaker, in her fear and prejudice, had weaponized the police against a young man whose only crime was an act of kindness. For Jamal, this moment was a harsh awakening to the realities of the world he lived in. The pride he had felt in helping a neighbor was now tainted by the bitter taste of injustice. As he looked at his parents' faces, a mixture of anger, sadness, and resignation reflected back at him. He realized that this was a turning point, not just for him, but for his entire community. As the police officers left the Thompson residence, apologizing for the inconvenience and assuring them that no further action would be taken, Jamal retreated to his room. The weight of what had just transpired pressed down on him, threatening to crush the optimism and goodwill that had always been his defining traits. For hours he sat in silence, replaying the events in his mind. The kindness he had shown, the brief connection he thought he had made with Mrs. Whitaker, and then the shocking betrayal of trust, it all swirled in his thoughts like a tempest. Part of him wanted to give in to the anger and hurt, to let bitterness take root and change him. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his room, Jamal made a decision. He wouldn't let this incident define him or alter his fundamental belief in the goodness of people. Instead, he would use it as a catalyst for change. With renewed determination, Jamal emerged from his room and called a family meeting. Marcus and Cheryl, who had been worriedly discussing the situation in hushed tones in the kitchen, were surprised by the fire in their son's eyes. "I want to do something about this," Jamal declared. "Not just for me, but for our community. We can't let fear and misunderstanding keep driving us apart." His parents exchanged a glance, a mixture of pride and concern evident in their expressions. "What do you have in mind, son?" Marcus asked cautiously. Jamal laid out his plan. He wanted to organize a neighborhood meeting, a forum where people could come together to discuss their fears, share their experiences, and work towards building a stronger, more united community. He envisioned inviting local leaders, setting up workshops on unconscious bias, and creating opportunities for neighbors to get to know each other beyond superficial interactions. Cheryl's eyes shone with unshed tears of pride, but her voice was hesitant. "Jamal, honey, that's a wonderful idea, but are you sure you want to take this on? It won't be easy. Some people might not be ready to listen." Jamal nodded, his resolve unwavering. "I know it won't be easy, Mom, but if we don't try, nothing will ever change. I have to believe that most people deep down want to do the right thing. They just need the opportunity." With his parents' blessing, Jamal threw himself into organizing the community meeting. He created flyers, reached out to local community leaders and civil rights organizations, and even contacted the police department to invite them to participate in the dialogue. The response was mixed. Some neighbors embraced the idea enthusiastically, eager for a chance to address the underlying tensions that had been simmering in the community. Others were skeptical, worried that the meeting would only exacerbate existing divisions. A few, to Jamal's disappointment, reacted with outright hostility, accusing him of stirring up trouble. As news of the incident with Mrs. Whitaker spread, Jamal found himself at the center of a local controversy. Some hailed him as a young hero, standing up against injustice. Others painted him as a troublemaker, questioning his motives and even his character. The stress began to take its toll. Jamal's grades started to slip as he poured more and more time into his community initiative. He found himself lying awake at night, second-guessing his decision and wondering if he was doing more harm than good. But for every setback, there were moments of hope. The owner of the local community center offered the space for the meeting free of charge. A retired judge volunteered to moderate the discussion. Even some of Jamal's teachers at school expressed their support, incorporating themes of community and social justice into their lessons. As the day of the meeting approached, tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. Jamal's family received anonymous phone calls, some supportive, others threatening. The local news caught wind of the story, and suddenly, Jamal found himself thrust into the spotlight, giving interviews and trying to articulate his vision for a more united community. Through it all, Mrs. Whitaker remained silent. She hadn't left her house since the incident, and all attempts by the Thompsons or other neighbors to reach out had been rebuffed. Her silence was a constant reminder of the challenge Jamal faced. how to bridge a divide that seemed at times insurmountable. The night before the community meeting, Jamal stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, and for a moment, doubt crept in. Was he really ready for this? Could one 17-year-old boy really make a difference in the face of such deeply rooted issues? As if in answer to his unspoken questions, he saw a light flick on in Mrs. Whitaker's house. For a brief moment, he caught a glimpse of the old woman peering out from behind her curtains. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that instant, Jamal's resolve solidified. Tomorrow would be a new day, a chance to start healing the rifts in their community. Whatever the outcome, he knew he had to try. While Jamal's story had captured the attention of many in the community, another narrative was unfolding in the background, one that would ultimately intertwine with Jamal's quest for understanding and reconciliation. At Oak Ridge High School, Jamal's English teacher, Miss Abigail Chen, had been deeply moved by her students' courage and determination. Inspired by Jamal's actions, she decided to adapt her curriculum to address issues of racial bias and community division. She introduced a unit on contemporary literature dealing with social justice, assigning books like The Hate U Give and American Son. The new material sparked intense discussions in class, with students from various backgrounds sharing their experiences and perspectives. Some students, like Jamal's best friend Michael, a white student from a conservative family, found themselves questioning long-held beliefs. Others, like Zara, a Muslim girl who wore a hijab, felt empowered to speak up about the discrimination they had faced. As word of Miss Chen's new curriculum spread, it ignited a firestorm of controversy. Some parents complained that the material was too politically charged for a high school classroom. The school board called an emergency meeting to address the issue, and suddenly, Miss Chen found herself at the center of a heated debate about education, censorship, and the role of schools in addressing social issues. Jamal, already stretched thin by his community organizing efforts, felt compelled to support his teacher. He organized a student petition in favor of keeping the new curriculum and spoke passionately at the school board meeting. His involvement brought even more attention to both causes, linking the neighborhood conflict with the broader issues of education and social awareness. Meanwhile, Officer Derek Hawkins, one of the policemen who had responded to Mrs. Whitaker's call, found himself increasingly troubled by the incident. A 15-year veteran of the force, Hawkins had seen his fair share of racial profiling and false accusations. But something about this case, the look in Jamal's eyes, the obvious misunderstanding at its core, wouldn't let him rest. Against the advice of his superiors, Hawkins reached out to the Thompson family. He apologized for his role in the incident and offered to speak at Jamal's community meeting about the challenges and responsibilities of policing in a diverse community. His decision was met with mixed reactions from his colleagues, some of whom felt he was betraying the brotherhood of the force. As these various threads began to intertwine, the story took on a life of its own. Local media outlets picked up on the connection between Jamal's initiative and the school curriculum controversy. Online forums buzzed with debates about race, education, and community policing. The quiet suburb of Maple Street had become an unexpected battleground in a much larger cultural conversation. Through it all, Mrs. Whitaker remained a silent enigma. Neighbors reported seeing deliveries left on her porch, but the curtains remained drawn, and no one had seen her leave the house since the day of the incident. Her silence and isolation stood in stark contrast to the whirlwind of activity surrounding Jamal and his cause. As the day of the community meeting drew near, tensions in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Lines were being drawn, allegiances formed and broken. What had started as one boy's attempt to right a wrong had ballooned into a complex web of interconnected issues and conflicting viewpoints. Jamal, watching it all unfold with a mixture of pride and trepidation, couldn't help but wonder. Had he opened Pandora's box? And if so, could the hope at the bottom be enough to heal the rifts that had been exposed? In the midst of the growing controversy, Jamal found unexpected allies and faced challenging dynamics within his existing relationships. The whirlwind of events had a profound impact on how he interacted with those around him, forcing him to navigate complex emotional terrain, while staying true to his convictions. One of the most surprising developments was Jamal's evolving relationship with Officer Hawkins. What had started as a tense encounter on that fateful Saturday morning had transformed into a tentative alliance. Hawkins, moved by Jamal's maturity and determination, began to see the young man as more than just another face in the community he policed. Their conversations, initially awkward and guarded, gradually became more open and honest. Hawkins shared his experiences as a police officer, the challenges he faced, and his own struggles with witnessing and sometimes participating in systemic injustice. Jamal, in turn, offered his perspective as a young black man growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood. "I never wanted to be seen as a threat," Jamal confided during one of their talks. "But sometimes it feels like that's all some people see when they look at me." Hawkins nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been guilty of that myself," he admitted. "It's easy to fall into patterns, to let fear and prejudice guide your actions. But meeting you, seeing your courage, it's made me realize how much damage those assumptions can do." As they worked together to prepare for the community meeting, a genuine respect and understanding began to grow between them. This unlikely friendship became a powerful symbol of the change Jamal was trying to create, a living example of bridging divides through open dialogue and shared purpose. However, not all of Jamal's relationships were evolving positively. His friendship with Michael, once rock solid, had become strained. Michael's parents, uncomfortable with the attention Jamal's actions had brought to the neighborhood, had forbidden their son from participating in the community meeting preparations. "I'm sorry, man," Michael said, unable to meet Jamal's eyes. "My dad says it's not our fight, that you're stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any." The words stung Jamal deeply. "Not your fight?" he repeated, disbelief coloring his voice. "Michael, we've been friends since kindergarten. How can you say it's not your fight when it affects me, your best friend?" The resulting argument left both boys hurt and confused, their years of friendship suddenly on shaky ground. Jamal found himself grappling with feelings of betrayal and isolation, realizing that even those closest to him might not fully understand or support his cause. On the home front, Jamal's relationship with his parents deepened in unexpected ways. Marcus and Cheryl, initially concerned about the toll the events were taking on their son, became his staunchest supporters. They sat up late into the night, helping him strategize and offering emotional support when the pressure became overwhelming. "You've always been special, Jamal," Cheryl said one night, her eyes shining with pride. "But watching you stand up for what's right, seeing you grow into this role, it's beyond anything we could have imagined for you." Marcus nodded in agreement. "You're fighting battles we hoped you wouldn't have to," he added, his voice gruff with emotion. "But you're doing it with grace and wisdom beyond your years. We couldn't be prouder." These moments of family solidarity became Jamal's anchor, giving him strength when doubt and fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. Perhaps the most complex relationship development was the one that existed only in potential: Jamal's connection to Mrs. Whitaker. Despite the pain her actions had caused, Jamal couldn't bring himself to hate the old woman. Instead, he found himself wondering about her life, what experiences had shaped her fears and prejudices. Late at night, Jamal would sometimes stand at his window, looking out at Mrs. Whitaker's darkened house. He imagined conversations they might have, bridges they might build. In his mind, he crafted eloquent speeches that would open her heart and mind, fantasizing about a Hollywood-style reconciliation. But the reality remained cold and distant. Mrs. Whitaker's silence was a wall between them, a constant reminder of the work that still needed to be done. As the community meeting approached, Jamal held onto a sliver of hope that somehow, some way, he could reach her. That hope, fragile as it was, became a driving force, pushing him forward, even as other relationships shifted and changed around him. The day of the community meeting dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing in the neighborhood. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers set up chairs, hung signs promoting unity and understanding, and prepared refreshments for what promised to be a long and intense discussion. Jamal arrived early, his stomach a knot of nerves and excitement. He was greeted by a mix of supportive smiles and wary glances as he made his way through the growing crowd. Miss Chen was there with a group of students, including Zara, who gave Jamal a thumbs up. Officer Hawkins stood off to the side, looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes but offering a nod of encouragement. As the meeting was about to begin, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to the entrance, where a small, frail figure stood hesitantly in the doorway. Mrs. Whitaker, looking pale and uncertain, had decided to attend. Jamal's heart raced as he watched the old woman make her way slowly to an empty seat, aided by a middle-aged man he recognized as her son. The room was thick with tension, whispers and meaningful glances bouncing between attendees. The moderator, the retired judge, called the meeting to order. "We're here today to have an open and honest discussion about our community," she began, "to address fears, misconceptions, and to find a way forward together." What followed was 2 hours of intense, often emotional dialogue. Residents shared stories of discrimination, of feeling unsafe in their own neighborhood. Others expressed frustration with changing demographics and fears about crime. Officer Hawkins spoke candidly about the challenges of policing and the need for better community relations. Throughout it all, Jamal listened intently, occasionally offering his perspective or gently challenging a prejudiced view. His composure and articulation impressed many, even those who had been skeptical of his motives. As the meeting neared its end, Mrs. Whitaker slowly rose to her feet. The room fell silent once more. I have something to say," she said, her voice quavering. "I made a terrible mistake. I let fear cloud my judgment, and I hurt an innocent young man who had shown me nothing but kindness." Tears welled in her eyes as she turned to face Jamal. "I'm so sorry, young man. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that you've opened my eyes. Your courage in organizing this meeting, in trying to bring us all together despite what I did, it's made me realize how wrong I've been." The room was utterly still as Jamal stood and walked over to Mrs. Whitaker. For a moment they stood face to face, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. Then, in a gesture that would be talked about for years to come, Jamal gently took Mrs. Whitaker's hand in his. "Thank you for coming today, Mrs. Whitaker," he said softly, "and thank you for your apology. It means more than you know." The simple act of compassion broke the tension in the room. There wasn't a dry eye to be found as Jamal and Mrs. Whitaker embraced, the physical embodiment of the healing that the community so desperately needed. As the meeting concluded, there was a palpable sense of change in the air. Old grudges had been aired, misconceptions challenged, and the first tentative steps towards genuine understanding had been taken. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Deep-seated issues couldn't be solved in a single afternoon, but it was a start. And for Jamal, standing tall amidst a community forever changed by his actions, it was proof that one person, armed with kindness and determination, could indeed make a difference. In the days following the emotionally charged community meeting, Maple Street and its surrounding neighborhoods found themselves in a state of cautious optimism. The raw honesty and powerful moments of connection displayed at the gathering had left a lasting impression on many attendees. However, translating that momentary unity into lasting change proved to be a complex and often frustrating process. Jamal, buoyed by the success of the meeting, but aware of the fragility of the progress made, threw himself into the work of community building with renewed vigor. He organized follow-up sessions, focusing on specific issues raised during the main meeting. These smaller, more intimate gatherings allowed for deeper discussions and practical problem-solving. One such session focused on improving communication between the community and local law enforcement. Officer Hawkins played a key role, acting as a bridge between his fellow officers and the residents. Together, they developed ideas for community policing initiatives, including regular Coffee with a Cop events and youth mentorship programs. "It's not going to fix everything overnight," Hawkins admitted during one of these sessions, "but it's a start. It's about building relationships, about seeing each other as people first, not just uniforms or stereotypes." Another group, led by Ms. Chen and several of her students, focused on education and cultural exchange. They proposed a series of neighborhood potlucks, each featuring cuisine and customs from different cultures represented in the community. The idea was to use food as a universal language, a way to bring people together and foster understanding through shared experiences. Jamal also worked closely with Mrs. Whitaker, who, true to her word at the community meeting, was committed to making amends and changing her perspectives. Together, they started a program pairing elderly residents with local teens for basic home maintenance and companionship. This initiative not only provided practical help to seniors, but also worked to break down generational barriers and misconceptions. "I never thought I'd say this," Mrs. Whitaker confided to Jamal one afternoon as they worked on matching volunteers, "but you young people give me hope for the future. I've lived on this street for 50 years, and I've never felt more connected to my neighbors than I do now." However, not everyone was on board with the changes taking place in the community. A vocal minority, led by Michael's father, Mr. Breslin, pushed back against what they saw as unnecessary agitation of the status quo. They argued that the recent events had painted the neighborhood in a negative light, potentially affecting property values and community reputation. Tensions came to a head at a town council meeting where Jamal and his supporters were presenting proposals for some of their new initiatives. Mr. Breslin and his group showed up in force, armed with counter-arguments and thinly veiled accusations. "While I'm sure young Jamal means well," Mr. Breslin said, his voice dripping with condescension, "these programs are an unnecessary drain on community resources. They're creating problems where none existed before. Our neighborhood was peaceful before all this started." The room erupted into heated debate. Supporters of Jamal's initiatives pointed out the long-standing issues that had been ignored, while opponents accused them of exaggerating problems for political gain. The meeting threatened to dissolve into chaos until Jamal stood up to speak. "Mr. Breslin," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I respect your right to your opinion, but I have to disagree that our neighborhood was peaceful before. It was quiet, yes, but that quiet came at a cost. It was the silence of people feeling unwelcome, misunderstood, and sometimes even afraid in their own community." Jamal paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with faces both friendly and hostile. "What we're trying to do here isn't about creating problems. It's about acknowledging the problems that already exist and working together to solve them. It's about building a community where everyone feels safe, valued, and heard." His words seemed to resonate with many in the room, even some who had been skeptical. Mrs. Whitaker, who had insisted on attending to support Jamal, stood up slowly. "I was like you, Mr. Breslin," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I thought everything was fine the way it was. It took a painful incident and the forgiveness of this remarkable young man to make me see how wrong I was. These changes may be uncomfortable, but they're necessary. They're making us better." The meeting ended without a clear resolution, but the tide of public opinion seemed to be shifting. More and more residents were coming around to Jamal's vision of a more inclusive and connected community. As Jamal left the town hall that evening, he was approached by Michael, who had been watching the proceedings from the back of the room. "That was really something," Michael said, shuffling his feet awkwardly. "Look, I'm sorry about before. I should have stood by you. You were right. This is my fight too. Our fight. If you'll still have me, I'd like to help." Jamal felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he clasped his friend's hand. "Always," he said with a smile. "We're stronger together, right?" As they walked home, discussing plans and possibilities, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but with each small victory, each mind opened and hand extended in friendship, he knew they were moving in the right direction. The work of healing and uniting their community had only just begun, but the foundations were growing stronger every day. The weeks following the town council meeting marked a subtle but significant shift in the community's dynamics. While tensions still simmered beneath the surface, there was an undeniable sense of momentum building behind Jamal's initiatives. The controversy had forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about their neighborhood, and many were choosing to engage rather than retreat. This shift was perhaps most evident in the changing attitude of the local media. What had started as sensationalized coverage of a racial incident had evolved into nuanced reporting on community transformation. Jamal found himself being interviewed not as a victim or an agitator, but as a young leader with a vision for positive change. One crisp autumn morning, as leaves crunched underfoot and the air held the promise of change, Jamal received an unexpected call. It was from the mayor's office, inviting him to be part of a newly formed youth advisory council for the city. The mayor, impressed by Jamal's poise and commitment, wanted to harness that energy on a broader scale. This invitation represented a turning point for Jamal. It was an opportunity to expand his influence beyond Maple Street, to take the lessons learned in his own neighborhood and apply them on a larger scale. But it also presented a dilemma. Accepting the position would mean less time for his local initiatives, the very work that had brought him to this point. After much contemplation and discussions with his parents, Miss Chen, and even Mrs. Whitaker, Jamal decided to accept the position. He saw it not as abandoning his community, but as a chance to amplify their collective voice. "You've laid a strong foundation here," Mrs. Whitaker told him, her eyes shining with pride. "Now it's time for you to build on it, to help other communities find their way like you helped us." Jamal's new role on the Youth Advisory Council opened up a world of possibilities. He found himself in meetings with city planners, education officials, and community leaders from all over the city. His experiences on Maple Street gave him unique insights into grassroots community building, insights that seasoned officials found valuable and refreshing. But this new direction wasn't without its challenges. Jamal had to learn to navigate the complex world of city politics, where change often moved at a frustratingly slow pace. He had to balance his schoolwork, his commitments to Maple Street, and his new responsibilities to the city. There were times when the pressure felt overwhelming, when Jamal questioned if he was spreading himself too thin. But in those moments, he would remember the night he helped Mrs. Whitaker with her light, the spark that had started it all. He would think of the faces at the community meeting, of Michael's return to their friendship, of Officer Hawkins' commitment to change. These memories served as a compass, guiding Jamal as he worked to create ripples of change that extended far beyond his own neighborhood. He was no longer just the kind black boy who helped an old woman fix her light. He was becoming a beacon of hope for a city learning to confront its divisions and work towards unity. As autumn deepened into winter, Jamal stood at the threshold of a new chapter in his life. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with both promise and challenges. But armed with the lessons of the past months, supported by a community he had helped to transform, Jamal was ready to take the next step in his journey of growth and change. As the year drew to a close, Jamal found himself in a reflective mood. Sitting in his room, surrounded by college brochures, community project plans, and newspaper clippings chronicling the events of the past months, he marveled at how much had changed, both in his community and within himself. The naive optimism that had driven him to help Mrs. Whitaker that fateful evening had been tempered by experience, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of social change. He had learned that progress was rarely linear, that for every 2 steps forward, there was often a step back. But rather than discouraging him, this knowledge had only strengthened his resolve. Jamal's worldview had expanded dramatically. Through his work on the Youth Advisory Council, he had been exposed to a diverse array of perspectives and experiences. He had learned to listen more deeply, to seek understanding before judgment, and to find common ground even with those whose views differed drastically from his own. "You know, son," Marcus said one evening as they worked together on Jamal's college applications, "watching you these past months, it's like seeing you grow years in just a matter of weeks. You've always been compassionate, but now there's a wisdom there too." Jamal nodded, considering his father's words. "I feel like I understand you and Mom better now," he replied. "All those talks we had about navigating a world that isn't always fair or kind. I get it now, in a way I didn't before." His relationship with his parents had indeed deepened. The shared experience of confronting community tensions head-on had brought them closer, fostering a new level of mutual respect and understanding. Jamal's friendships, too, had evolved. His reconciliation with Michael had led to deeper conversations about privilege, allyship, and the role of white community members in combating racism. These discussions weren't always easy, but they were always valuable, pushing both boys to grow and learn. Perhaps the most profound change was in Jamal's sense of self. The boy who had once sought to avoid conflict, who had tried to blend in despite standing out, now stood tall in his identity. He had found his voice and learned the power of using it for positive change. "You've awoken something in this community," Miss Chen told him during one of their regular check-ins. "But more than that, you've awoken something in yourself. That's the real victory here." As he reflected on her words, Jamal realized that she was right. The incidents of the past months had forced him to confront harsh realities about the world, but they had also shown him his own strength, resilience, and capacity for leadership. He thought about Mrs. Whitaker, how their relationship had transformed from one of fear and misunderstanding to mutual respect and even affection. Their weekly meetings, initially focused on the Senior Youth Partnership Program, had become cherished opportunities for intergenerational learning and sharing. "You've taught this old dog some new tricks," Mrs. Whitaker often joked, but the sentiment behind her words was genuine. She had become one of Jamal's most vocal supporters, her own journey of growth, a testament to the power of open-mindedness and compassion. As Jamal looked towards the future, to college, to new challenges and opportunities, he felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The events on Maple Street had shaped him in ways he was still discovering, setting him on a path he had never anticipated, but now couldn't imagine leaving. He picked up a framed photo from his desk, a snapshot from the community's Harmony Day celebration, an event born from the initiatives he had helped create. Smiling faces of all ages and backgrounds beamed back at him, a visual reminder of what was possible when people came together with open hearts and minds. Jamal smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but he was ready to face them. Armed with the lessons of the past and the support of his community, he looked forward to continuing the work of building bridges, fostering understanding, and creating positive change, one small act of kindness at a time. As dawn broke over Maple Street on a crisp spring morning, Jamal stood on his front porch, taking in the sight of his neighborhood. The physical landscape hadn't changed much since that summer evening when he'd helped Mrs. Whitaker with her light, but the community's spirit had undergone a profound transformation. The once quiet streets now buzzed with the energy of neighbors greeting each other warmly, regardless of age or background. The community center, once a neglected building, had become a hub of activity, hosting everything from cultural exchange events to police community dialogue sessions. Jamal's gaze fell on Mrs. Whitaker's house, where the old woman was tending to her garden alongside a group of teenagers, participants in the Senior Youth Partnership Program. The sight filled him with a sense of pride and hope. As he prepared to leave for a meeting of the Youth Advisory Council, Jamal reflected on the journey that had brought him and his community to this point. It hadn't been easy, and there was still work to be done, but the progress was undeniable. The events of the past year had taught Jamal and his neighbors valuable lessons about the power of empathy, the importance of open dialogue, and the transformative potential of small acts of kindness. They had learned that change, while often challenging, was possible when people came together with open hearts and minds. As Jamal stepped off his porch ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring, he carried with him the knowledge that one person, armed with compassion and determination, could indeed spark a movement. The light he had fixed that summer evening had illuminated far more than Mrs. Whitaker's living room. It had lit a path towards understanding, unity, and a brighter future for all.